Few minutes, hopefully talking about some things that will motivate us and help us understand that motivation. Looking for... There we go. Have you ever had trouble with motivation? Have you ever had something kind of reminding you over and over, maybe of something that you did need to do? Like, for instance, my lovely wife Melanie is here, and she is not one to nag. However, we are working on 32 years of marriage, and I have learned, it took me a while, but I have learned the subtle variations in languages that can be put forth, like, for instance, when she said to me, "We need to paint the guest bathroom." I know that means you need to paint the guest bathroom. And on this particular day, I did not want to do that. I was not going to do that. And I dig my heels in. And then the next time it is, we really need to paint the guest bathroom. And I'm not going to do it. So later that day, as I'm painting the guest bathroom, I realized that I have been motivated, perhaps in a negative connotation, one might say, goaded into doing something. Now, all my kids are sitting there looking at me like they hadn't painted the guest bathroom since we moved into the house. So, but you understand the idea. In the story of the life of Saul of Tarsus, we have a very significant event when he was motivated to make a change, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning and see what we can learn from it, and maybe what we can put to work in our lives as some thoughts that we bring forth from that. Just a quick note about the name of Saul/Paul. Saul of Tarsus was Saul's Hebrew name. Paul was his Roman name. He was born in Tarsus, and that was a Roman city, a Roman province at the time. So a lot of folks think that his name was changed, maybe perhaps even by Jesus in this interaction that they had on the road to Damascus. After Acts 13, verse 9, which actually says, Saul, who was also called Paul, the Bible only refers to him as Paul. It doesn't necessarily mean that his name changed, but what it does tell us is that Jesus himself sent Saul, to the Gentiles. This is forgive the terminology, very, very Jewish person who was commissioned by the Son of God to go and preach the gospel to people who weren't Jews. And that's significant. So it makes sense that he would refer to himself, and that the Bible, inspired Word of God, would refer to him as Paul. But the name was not what changed when Saul's motivation was changed. It was his heart that was changed. And what I would like to explore this morning is the thought that there were numerous influences over that change that took place with Saul of Tarsus. And one other note of housekeeping before we move on into the lesson. The key verse from Acts 9 is verse 5. If you are reading from the English Standard Version, the part of that key verse that is very important to the lesson is not included. It is, however, included in Paul's own account of this later in Acts 26. But just a note. So from the New King James, the King James, all of this is included. It's all important because it's the inspired Word of God, but specifically kicking against the goads that comes from Jesus himself is not included in the ESV and other translations. So who is this Saul that we are talking about this morning? In Acts 9, 1 through 6, we'll read it again. Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, capital W, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. Then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Capital M. And he said, who are you, Lord? Then the Lord said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. And this statement, I think very impactful one, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. It is hard for you. Jesus says to Saul, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. Verse 6, so he, Saul, trembling and astonished, his reaction to this is to say, Lord, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? Well, we learn a lot from these verses. First of all, the text says that Saul is still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of Jesus. The word still, of course, indicates that there has been past activity of breathing thoughts and murders against these disciples of Jesus. We learn about these things and are introduced first to Saul at the stoning of Stephen in Acts 7:58. And there we see a disciple of Jesus, an outspoken one, who is telling the truth to members of the Sanhedrin, and as a result of his truth being so truthful that they hated him for it, they take him outside the city and they stone him to death. And we know in that verse it says that the witnesses laid their cloaks at the feet of a young man named Saul. Saul was there. Some even say this might have indicated that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. We don't know that for sure, but he was there. And then in Acts 8:1, it says that Saul was consenting to Stephen's death. So if we really take a second and think about what happened here, a human being proclaiming what he knew to be the truth about Jesus and about the history of the Jews and how it relates to Jesus, because they hated him for what he said, they took him out and they murdered him. And Saul was consenting to his death. And as a result of this, after this, a great persecution arose against the church that was at Jerusalem. Remember, all of these people came to Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. The church was begun, and many of them, the church then grew out from there and was, for the most part, not headquartered, but centralized. This was kind of ground zero for the church. We know there is no earthly headquarters, but the Church of Jesus Christ was begun in Jerusalem, and therefore there was a concentration of people there. There were other people that had gone out away from that, but there were a lot of people there. And Saul began to make havoc for that church. He began to make havoc, and if you think about, that's a very strong word, an intense word, havoc. And in Acts chapter 9, which we just read, we have authority given to him from the high priest to travel to Damascus. Okay? So Saul was making havoc of the church. We know that Stephen was, we call him the first Christian martyr. He died because of his faith. Saul was there. He was consenting. He was making havoc. And now he is taking this thing that he's motivated to do and going on the road with it. Okay? This is somebody who was very motivated to do what he's doing. And while thus engaged, we have this interaction between Saul and Jesus. What was Saul's motivation? How did he become this man breathing threats and murder against God's people? Well, first of all, he was a Jew. The Bible tells us that he was educated by Gamaliel in Acts 22, verses 3 to 5. Now, this is Paul's own description of himself in his defense at Jerusalem one of the times when he was arrested. He says, I am indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you all are today. Then he confesses, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. So, as also the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders from whom I also received letters to the brethren, went to Damascus to bring in chains even those who were there back to Jerusalem to be punished. So, what was it that motivated Paul? He was a Jew, first and foremost. So, during the time that he's still involved in this persecution, he was educated by Gamaliel. Well, who was Gamaliel? Gamaliel the elder, or Rabbin Gamaliel, was a leading authority in the Sanhedrin in the first century day and time. He was the grandson of a lauded Jewish teacher. So this was somebody very known and respected in Jewish circles, somebody that was of the strictest law of the Pharisees. And Saul, it says, was brought up under his teaching. So these were the things that were in his mind as he was a young man growing up. Second to that, he was taught the strictness of the law. He was zealous toward God. He had this motivation inside him because of the things that he had learned, and he lived as a Pharisee. Saul was deeply committed to a very difficult task because of his belief that it was the right thing. He was so certain that he knew that these people who were following a man who claimed to be the Son of God were wrong. And he was deeply committed to stamping that out in any way that he could. So much so that his job of doing this became one where he got to travel. And he was going to Damascus with authority in his hand to go there. And if you can think about this, going into the homes of people and dragging out the men and women who were followers of Jesus. Bringing them, if you can imagine bringing someone in chains from Damascus back to Jerusalem, this was something that you would have to be motivated to do it. Because I actually, through the advent of technology today, actually went on and got the directions from Jerusalem to Damascus today. Today, it's a 4.5-hour drive. Then I clicked on that little walk button. It would take today, with good roads that we have, 56 hours to walk from Jerusalem to Damascus. So if you can imagine, with the pedestrian types of transportation that they had in the first century, Saul would have to be very motivated to go there and arrest people and bring them back to Jerusalem. So there's no question about his motivation. But then there was this turning point for Saul. And in his own account of this turning point event, in his defense before Agrippa, we see what happened. In Acts 26, verses 12 to 16, he says, "While thus occupied, I journeyed to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priests. At midday, O king," because he's talking to Agrippa here, "along the road I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and those who journeyed with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And again, Saul's account of this statement by Jesus, 'It is hard for you to kick against the goads.' So I said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said, 'I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister and a witness both of the things," this is important here, "both of the things which you have seen and of the things which I will yet reveal to you." So Jesus tells Saul, it's hard for you to kick against the goads, but I'm going to tell you what you need to do. And you're going to have this mission that is going to be based on what you have experienced in the past and what I will reveal to you. And this was the turning point for Saul. We have this voice of the Lord, we have a question, and we have the statement. And we know from our understanding of the Bible that this was a turning point, that things did change. The rest of the story, not with the lessons about this morning, but that Saul does do what Jesus tells him. He goes, he finds Ananias. He knows that it was Jesus that talked to him. He repents of his sin. He's baptized. And from that point on, his life has changed significantly. This was a turning point. But what did Jesus mean by this statement, "It is hard for you to kick against the goads"? Well, first we need to define exactly what is a goad. A goad, and this is from Easton's Bible Dictionary, a goad, a Hebrew word malmad, and this is seen in Judges 3:31, is an instrument used by somebody who's plowing a field. And in that day and time, oxen were very, very strong animals that were used for this purpose. So if you can imagine the ox hooked up to the plow and plowing the field, and the animal doesn't always want to do what it's there for, so they use this long stick. It could be anywhere from 6 to 10 feet long with a sharp, perhaps metal point at the end, and the plowman would use that to remind the ox of what his purpose is, or put him in the right direction, goading it along with this sharp pointed stick. The goad is there, again, to remind the animal of its purpose and its highest and best use. What is the result of this sometimes? Well, the animal sometimes would respond by kicking against that. I don't want to have that experience. And if you can imagine kicking against something that's very sharp, it would harm the animal that's resisting. And then, so Jesus says to Saul, "Why do you continue in a course that is harming you?" So there has to have been something that has happened in Saul's life before this that Jesus is insinuating you're resisting. And that's in the balance of our time this morning, what I want us to think about, and perhaps what it might mean for us. What was it that was goading Saul? What was it, not some small voice that's only from his conscience, but what was it in what Saul had known and what he had seen that might have caused him to respond favorably when he was finally approached and confronted by Jesus? Well, here are some possibilities. First of all, what he knew. And from Philippians 3 here, we see some of what Paul knew and why he knew it. Paul again himself says in Philippians, "We are the circumcision." And he means, of course, from that we are the Jews. Circumcision was this very physical manifestation of one's Jewish religion. It is a fleshly, physical manifestation. We are the circumcision who worship God in the Spirit, rejoice in Jesus Christ. Now he's talking about Jews who had become followers of Christ. And because of that, we can surmise here, because of we're following Christ, we have no confidence in the flesh. We're not about that old law anymore that was so tied to these fleshly, earthly things. He says we have no confidence in the flesh. Though, he says, I also might have confidence in the flesh. If anyone else thinks he may have confidence in the flesh, I more so, Paul says. Why? Because I was circumcised on the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, concerning the law, a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, concerning the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. Paul says, if anybody ever would have confidence in the flesh and try to bind these Jewish laws on Christians, it would be me. Of course, by implication, he's saying, but I'm not doing that because I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. But we see Paul knew when he was still in this role as Saul of Tarsus, the Jew, the Pharisee, persecuting Christians, he knew all of the history and the law of the Hebrews. Now, why does that matter in when we think about what he became, well, I think it does. So what he knew was very important. Another aspect of what he knew the prophecies of the coming Messiah. You ever thought about that with regard to Saul? That this is one of the smartest, most motivated people on the earth, and we could say, even in a positive connotation, a very religious person. He was very motivated in his faith. And he knew the prophecies of the coming Messiah. Paul himself, writing in the book of Romans, says, Paul, a bondservant, as he's introducing the book, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated to the gospel of God, which he promised before through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who was born of the seed of David according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead. Through him we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith among all nations for his name, among whom you are also called of Jesus Christ. Saul had heard these prophecies. He, after becoming a follower of Christ, reiterates the fact that he knew these things. This wasn't something he learned after becoming a Christian. This was one of the smartest guys with regard to Jewish law that there ever was. He knew these things before he was confronted by Jesus. He knew the prophecies, he knew the history, he knew everything that could be known about the Jewish faith. Perhaps in hearing about Jesus, he was beginning to connect the dots about what he knew and then what he saw. So what else was it maybe that was goading Paul into the decision that he eventually made? And I think these can't be discounted. I think he was goaded along or motivated along by what he had seen. And one of the things that he had seen was the loving nature of the followers of Jesus Christ. Paul had come in contact with lots of Christians. Now, he did this through a very stressful interaction of arresting them and persecuting them, and sometimes those people may even have ended up dead. But he came in contact with Christians. Acts 7, verse 60, again, we revisit the stoning of Stephen. Stephen says, when he is about to die, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. Why would Stephen have said that? Well, he was following the example of Jesus. He was following the example of Jesus, who said, forgive them, they know not what they do. But this wasn't just two statements by two people. This was part of the way of life of those who claim to be followers of the Son of God, Christians, Christ ones. There's a lot about our understanding of Jesus that has to do with love. Saul would have had to have experienced this. We know he was there when Stephen said it. Now, can you imagine the countless number of people that he arrested and put in jail because of their love for Jesus? He would have to have been exposed and influenced by this, I believe. Secondly, he saw the dedication of the followers of Jesus. When he began to make havoc in the church there at Jerusalem through persecution, those who went, Acts 8:4 tells us, those who left went everywhere, but they didn't just run away. They went to other places and they began to preach the word there. Wherever they went, having been run out of town, wherever they settled, they began to preach the word. And that's why it was necessary for Paul, who wanted to stamp this religion out, to leave Jerusalem and go to other places. I believe that the impact of seeing a true follower of Jesus Christ had an effect on Saul. And I think that God, in his wisdom, knew when the right time was to approach him. And it was even while he was still involved in this persecution. So we started the lesson out this morning by asking the question, have you ever been motivated to do something that you knew you should do? And how does that process play out in your mind? So in the time that we have left this morning, just a few takeaways and questions that we can explore. Would Saul have been persuaded that Jesus was real by observing my life? Would Saul have been persuaded that Jesus is real by observing your life? Are the people that I have influence with in my life persuaded of anything with regard to my faith by their interaction and involvement with me? I think this is something that we need to consider. If we had been alive in the first century when Christians were being persecuted in Jerusalem, would we have been one that left town and continued preaching and teaching the word? Would we be motivated or goaded by knowing the right thing to do? Secondly, am I connecting the dots of my knowledge and the experiences that I have with God? In other words, we all gather, thankfully, on the first day of the week, twice, and we come back together for Bible study at various times. We happen to do that here at Bremen on Wednesday evening. And many of us have been doing that for many, many years. We've learned a lot about the Bible, I hope we have, over that time. Just like Saul, as a young man, sat at the feet of Gamaliel learning everything there was to know about Jewish law and history and the prophecies. When the time came in his life to connect the dots between what he knew in the past and what Jesus was confronting him with, nobody did a better job of using that knowledge to move forward than did Paul. Am I using what I'm learning week in, week out in my daily Bible study? Am I using it? Am I connecting the dots of those things also with the experiences that I have in life, knowing that every good and perfect gift comes from the Father above? Am I putting those things together, and does that motivate me to do more? Good question for us to ask ourselves this morning. And then further, does this process cause me to be more grateful and dedicated? Am I taking the time to count my blessings? Am I really giving God the credit for any good thing that happens in my life? Is it about Him or is it about me? And then finally, this morning, we might stop and think about, is there anything at all that I am being goaded into doing, motivated into doing, spiritually speaking? Do I need to study more? Do I need to improve my prayer life? Do I need to be more compassionate to others? Is there more that I can do to help the gospel be put forth in this community and beyond? Is there anything that I know, because of everything I know and have seen, that I can do to do more? But most importantly this morning, just like Saul on that road to Damascus, when he is motivated by this question from Jesus, do I need to put on Christ in baptism? Do I need to make that commitment that I have not made yet, put on Christ? If you have not obeyed the gospel, then there is no better time to consider doing that and to follow through. If there's anything that we can do, pray with you, pray for you, encourage you this morning, we would be happy to do so. But most importantly, the angels would rejoice as we would here if you need to make the decision to put on Christ. If so, please make that known as we stand and sing the song selected.